Okay.
I will say it in English.
Good, okay.
Perfect
Pure holy
gurus from the
gurus
billowing
on
clouds of wisdom and compassion in the sky of the Dharmakaya, please let fall a rain of profound and extensive Dharma upon the receptacle of those to be subdued.
Exactly as they need. And when we say this little mantra, when we say this little Sanskrit mantra, we imagine that Buddha very happily receives our offering. Idam
Guru
Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. Okay, so the next little prayer, I will lead this next one. And this is two parts. We'll do this in front of every teaching. So 2 parts. The first part is just for those of us who already feel we identify as Buddhists. It's reminding ourselves of our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings, taking refuge, in other words. And the second 2 lines, it's the Tibetans would say, stating our motivation. We might say, stating our purpose. Why are we here together? Is to listen to these teachings so that we can take some tools from it, so we can develop our own amazing potential, so we can be of benefit to others, all the way to Buddhahood. So I'll sing it in Tibetan. That's the English. That's the meaning of the words. Sangye charang choke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye druppa shok sangye charang choke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye druppa shok Sangye charang choke chognam la jangcho baru dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye druppa shok. Okay, good. All right, thank you, Anne. That's it. So I don't think I prepared any course notes, did I, Anne? I didn't send you any course notes, did I? No. Okay. So maybe I will prepare some, but we'll talk generally first, and then I can send some. I'll send a PDF with some things to read, and also I'll recommend some books that will be good to read if you want to go further. So anyway, this. But generally, I know when Lama Zopa Rinpoche started teaching Western people. This is a bit from my own experience, right? The Tibetans, Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe, who were the founders of our organization and the group and therefore the spiritual teacher of the group in Cluj and Bucharest, and my teachers, and the organization, the broader organization, has been going since. I mean, these lamas, Lama Yeshe left Tibet in 1959 with other hundreds and thousands of Tibetans, and then Lama Zopa, who was Nepali, he'd been recognized as a little boy as a reincarnated lama in Nepal. He was a Sherpa, but at that time in 59 he was just across the border in a monastery in Tibet. So anyway, when all the business happened in 59 and the Chinese came along and started taking over Tibet, they had to escape. So they both ended up in this place in the north of India, which is at the time of the British. At the time of the British, it used to be like a prison. And so it was this empty place, a big camp, and many of the lamas and the monks and people were all sent to that place. So that's where Lama Yeshe was. And Lama Yeshe at the time, he was about 25, and Lama Zopa was about 15. So they met there, Lama Zopa being a younger boy, and because he was what they call a Rinpoche, a tulku, he'd been formally recognized as a little boy as the reincarnation of this previous Sherpa Lama. So they always, these children, the young kids, I mean, it's still like that, they're given to one older monk to take care of. So he was basically handed over to Lama Yeshe, who was 10 years older. So he became his main teacher until Lama Yeshe passed away in 1982. So anyway, they were together, and then like a lot of these Tibetans coming down from the mountains, they got tuberculosis. It was a very common disease. Even now, when all the Tibetans come, they get tuberculosis. And so Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, they went up to Darjeeling, which was a little in India, a little bit higher. So it was a bit cooler, and therefore a good place to heal from tuberculosis. So soon around that time, about the mid-60s, that's when they met their first Western students. One woman called Zina, who was European, she was looking for a teacher, and she met these 2 lamas, and eventually she became a nun. And then in about 1967, they went down to Kathmandu, where already many of the Tibetans had settled. It was a very holy place, Kathmandu, incredible place, very special. All the Tibetans love it, you know. And the special place just out of the city called Bodhisattva, where there's this big stupa. You've seen pictures everywhere, big, unusual, big dome, very big stupa, been there for 1,000 years or something. So many Tibetans had gathered there. And so that at the same time, mid-60s, was about the same time that all these Western, you know, like American and English and European hippies were going off to Asia, looking at the same time, looking for drugs, but looking for enlightenment as well. For some reason, we connected these two together. It's so ridiculous, you know. So they started meeting Tibetans. And this is when the Buddhism began to really get, I mean, there's always some Buddhism in the West. This is when it really began to grow. So Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, with this first student, Zena, they then eventually, a couple of years later, because Kathmandu's in a valley. And there's this wonderful story, actually. This is the myths about how Kathmandu came about. Centuries ago, this is how they talk. It was a lake, and then Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, came along with his big sword, and he put a hole. He drained the lake, and then there's this. So all the Tibetans, for the Tibetans, they think it's one of the holiest places on the planet. I mean, when we go with our ordinary eyes, we just see this dirty place. It's very polluted, you know. But they feel it's such a blessed, special place. So anyway, on one of the hills around surrounding the valley, just up about 40-minute walk from Kathmandu, there was this special hill where there was a small house where one Nepali scholar and astrologer lived. It was his country home at the time. And so then somehow the Lama Yeshe was very attracted to this place, and then the Zena and her other friends, they managed to buy it, a small amount of land there. And that became what's known as Kopan Monastery, which is now, it's like a small town. There's 500 monks there. Just down the road, there are 500 nuns, all studying in the traditional Tibetan monastic university system. It's an incredible place. But when it just began, it began with a bunch of hippies going up there. Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa moved up there, and then they would give little teachings, or Lama Zopa would start to give classes to maybe 10, 12 people. And then about 1970, I think, or 71, 70 maybe, there was the first big course, like the next few months, a big course. Then from that time, this place became really famous for these big 1-month intensive meditation courses where the Lama Zopa mainly would teach this Tibetan way of presenting the teachings, which, as you know, is called the Lam Rim. So that's when they really began to, every year, more than 200 people would come to these courses. And that's the beginning of this organization, you know. So some of those students, like at 71, 72, so then they finally invited the Lamas in 1974. They came to Europe and Australia and America for the first time, and that's when the very first center started in the whole outside of Asia. It was in Australia, and it was called Chenrezig Institute. And then they started one in America called Vajrapani Institute, and they started a third one in England called Manjushri Institute. Well, what's interesting, those three names, we're going to talk about all this, you know, the three essential qualities of a Buddha. One is wisdom, that's Manjushri. One is power, which is Vajrapani. And one is compassion, which is Chenrezig. So there's the essential qualities of a Buddha. These are the goal of what we're all trying to accomplish. You know, this is the potential of our mind, which we're going to talk about. So the essence of the enlightened mind, which Buddha says is the potential of every single mind in the universe. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about. The main one is to have this immense compassion, the wish to benefit others. Then you've got the wisdom to know how to benefit others. But then you have to have the ability to do it. And these are the three essential qualities. Well, they're the first three centers that Lama Yeshe started and named for these three Buddhas. And then the organization started from then. So I know I met the Lamas actually at Chenrezig Institute. I'm from Australia. I met them in 2 years later. This started in 1974. I met them in 1976. I was about 31 or something. And that was my first intent. It was a course based upon the same courses that Lama Zopa would teach every November. They call it the 1-month November course. It's this 1-month intensive presentation of this Tibetan packaging of all the path to enlightenment, the Lam Rim. So Lama Zopa I did that course, and then another retreat after that with Lama Yeshe on Chenrezig, a tantric teaching on Chenrezig. That was my first introduction. So from my side, I was born in Melbourne, Queen Chenrezig Institute is in the northeast coast of Australia. So it's a bit like the Florida of Australia, except it's in the north because we're the other side of the world, right? The north is where the tropics are. So I was from Melbourne, which is in the south, and I was brought up there as a Catholic, one of 7 children. I was like the naughtiest, most rebellious kid. We went to the Catholic convent. My mother sent us to the Catholic convent for our education. But at the same time, I had incredible devotion in God. It was in my heart, though, not in my behavior, I promise. I was the worst kid. And I never talked about it. It was just my world inside. I read books about the saints. And as soon as I went to Mass when I was about 3, as soon as I saw the priest, I thought, yeah, that's my job. I was so happy to discover. So I announced to the family I was going to be a priest. And they all laughed, of course, because I wasn't a boy, right? Anyway, they said I had to be a nun. So meanwhile, there I was going to the Catholic convent and thinking about all these things and reading about the saints, but at the same time being very naughty and rebellious. And I remember when I was 13, I was on my knees begging my mother, just begging her to let me be a nun, like one of these really ascetic, the Carmelite nuns. I don't know if you have the Carmelite nuns in Romania. They're super intense. They pray and never talk and pray all night. I wanted to be one of them, And I cried when my mother said I wasn't allowed to be a nun. But then 20 years later, she cried when I became a Buddhist nun, Anyway, so in between that 20 years, quite a few things happened. So by the time I was 19, I gave up God. Now, by the time I was 15, I was brought up in Australia, right, which is very white. Sort of, if you're an Australian Aboriginal, you're not white. And they've been slaughtered by the white people. The white people do a good job of doing that around the world. Anyway, I didn't see any other. I saw maybe a couple of Chinese people. I didn't see many other people at all. Just saw nice white Catholic people all my life, right? I didn't even meet any Jewish people. I remember one girl at our Catholic school had a Jewish name. She was very surprising. So anyway, when I was 15, my mother was a classical musician and she taught me singing. And we were not allowed to listen to rock and roll. We were never allowed to listen to Elvis Presley, nothing like that. She was very strict. But I remember at school, I bought a record, a 7-inch LP of Billie Holiday. I said to myself, I wonder who he is. But that was the beginning of my listening to Black American music, which of course opened my mind and my heart to a whole new world because I always had this yearning to understand the world. Why is there suffering? Blah, 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 So then that affected me very deeply, and I started reading Black American literature. It was very powerful for my mind. So then by the time I was 19, it was time to say goodbye to God and hello to boys. And I didn't have guilt. I never agonized about that. I thought guilt was a waste of time. I just made a decision. Thank you, God. Goodbye. Now it's time for boys. So then I kind of became this raging hippie. But my mother was always hoping I would continue to study my classical singing. So when I was about 23, she sent me off to London. That was in 1967. But then, of course, now I'd left home. Everything was gone. I was ripe and ready for revolution, God knows what was happening in Romania in 1967. But anyway, I had all this idealized idea of, radical communism, blah, 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 So then I started, demonstrating and all that kind of business. And actually in 1969, my mother came to Europe to see me. I was this raging hippie. And then I went across from London to Moscow on the train because she was going to go to a big conference in Moscow. And I know when I was dressed like this wild hippie in Moscow, it was very shocking, I tell you. 1969 that was. Anyway, whatever. But by the time, so I sort of, in my life, I can think if I look back, I was always looking for a way to understand the world. I'm not trying to sound noble, So first it was the Catholic one, which was pretty intense. And then I had this and I was always very extreme and very radical in my views. So I was a serious hippie, trying to break down all the usual misconceptions and see the world in a different way. Then I became this raging, radical kind of communist, lefty activist demonstrating in London. Then I became very involved with black politics, all the whole business of sort of the imperialist world, causing suffering to all the brown and black people. And then I soon became a feminist. And so I became a radical feminist. And I sort of, by that point, honestly, this is how I think about it, I'd exhausted all options for who to blame for the suffering of the world. First, all the non-Catholics and the non-Christians were the problem, and then all the straight people were the problem, then all the rich people were the problem, then all the white people were the problem, then all the male people were the problem. Then what's left, So by that point, I stumbled across Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. I wanted something spiritual again, and that was when they, joking, they basically said, well, Robina, it's about time to start looking at your mind. And that's the thing for me that blew my mind, because everything in Buddhism is about the mind. not even just in an extra sense or a sort of, but it's the central thing. The more we understand the mind in Buddhism, the more we're going to really understand Buddhism, because Buddhism is, and it's quite unique in this way. You know, in our world, when we think of psychology, someone's there. Who's that? Okay, maybe the postman. So in our world, you know, when we think of psychology, it's one of the sciences, isn't it? But my feeling is it's the lowest one. We don't have much, I don't think we have much real kind of respect for great psychologists, because I think in our culture, there's no real, it's not very hard. We like hard sciences. Neuroscientists, yeah, they're the best, right? We want to see something real and solid that we can see through a microscope. That's our materialist philosophical view. I'm not criticizing, but it's just how it is. So, but for the Buddha, yes, there is philosophy, psychology, metaphysics, epistemology, etymology. There's an unbelievable body of knowledge that they study in these great monastic universities in Tibet, and still do in exile, which track themselves back to the great monastic university system called Nalanda. If you hear the Dalai Lama teach, you'll always hear him talk about we are the Nalanda tradition. This is an amazing monastic university that started in the 7th, 8th century and eventually collapsed around the 11th century. That was just this incredible place of learning. 10,000, 20,000 people there, all monks. I'm sure some nuns came along but had to dress up like boys because they weren't accepted, you know, being the world the way it is. But it was an incredible, and all the major scholars, any names you read in all the Buddhist literature, like Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna and Atisha and Asanga, all these people came from Nalanda. That's this great system. And the Tibetan, Nalanda died out, but it didn't die out totally. It just transferred over to Tibet. So all the great Tibetan monastic universities are still living in exile, and an unbroken chain since back more than 1,200, 1,400 years, you know, which of course tracking themselves back to the Buddha. So the thing is, I think, yeah, so this, okay, so mind, even though there's this vast body of knowledge, and we're going to discuss the different components, but the heart of it all is the understanding of the mind, what it is, what its nature is, where it comes from, how it functions, and its potential. That's the whole of Buddhism can be described in those terms, and everything else stems from that. All the Buddhist philosophy is rooted in that. All the Buddhist teachings about karma are rooted in that. All the Buddhist concept, you know, about the physical universe are rooted in that. It's in many ways fundamentally different. I mean, in most ways fundamentally different from the way we understand the mind, you know, in our culture, in our world. So anyway, here I am. How long ago is that? That's 46 years ago. Here I am, still working on my mind, still delighted by this experience. You know, so far so good is all I can say. All I can say is that so far so good, each step of the way, discovering the nature of my own mind, and therefore naturally helping other people with our minds, because that's the point. That's the point. That's the point. Okay, so what I find really marvelous to start with is this word Buddha. It's so fascinating. The etymology of that word is incredibly delicious. And actually, it tells us exactly the entire job. It implies the entire methodology of Buddhism. It's marvelous to start with this. So this is the end result. When you look at the packaging of the teachings, this packaging that's unique to Tibet, in our tradition from the 14th century, you know, because there are 4 main traditions in Tibet, and we are of the Gelugpa, the Sakya, Nyingma, Kagyu, and many other variations. But our lineage Lama, our patron saint, if you like, from the 14th century, Tsongkhapa, he packaged together all the Buddhist teachings, taking the essence from all the etymology, psychology, you know, all the Buddhist philosophy, taking from all of it the essential points of this path that end up leading to oneself becoming a Buddha. And so he presented it in a very experiential way. He took the essence from all that body of knowledge and presented this package of it, presented in an experiential way. Because it's easy, especially for us modern people, because we're so super intelligent and so well trained conceptually and intellectually and technically, it's easy to get very enthusiastic about the knowledge, but forgetting how to make it experiential. Because that's the biggest danger, especially the way we think in our modern world about the study of philosophy and ideas. We almost necessarily keep it away from experience. We almost think that experience lessens the value of it. We don't trust experience. We don't trust psychology. We don't trust the mind. We think it's too subjective. We're so obsessed with objectivity, something you can see with your eyes. This is absolutely not the Buddhist view. So it's very interesting, you know. So the crucial thing is, yes, there's a vast body of knowledge, like as I'm mentioning, from this Nalanda tradition in the Tibetan monastic university system. You know, and now nuns are becoming, you know, they graduate as these geshe, this title geshe that you see in our tradition. It's the title that you receive after you've studied 10, 15, 20 years and you get your degree. So now nuns in the Tibetan tradition are getting this degree. Our monastery in Kathmandu, near Kopan, there are many nuns now graduating as geshis. So that you study all this knowledge, but if you only leave it in the head, you know, that's like learning all the theoretical brilliant theories about music, but you can't play a note on the piano. People would call you a fraud. There's no question. If you know all the cake recipes but don't make a cake, people would laugh at you. But what's curious with philosophy, it's almost demanded that you don't practice it. We almost think of philosophy in our culture as something very objective, and you have all these ideas about the universe in your mind, but you leave them there. That is pretty demented. That's kind of crazy from the Buddhist view. I mean, I remember the one main American professor of Buddhism, Jeffrey Hopkins. He's been around since the 70s, and he was appointed the main professor he was the first Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, not just scholar. He is a scholar, but he was the first one who was known as a practitioner, who was appointed head of the Buddhist studies at a university in America, in Virginia, in the mid-70s. And I worked with him on one of his big books called Meditation on Emptiness. We published that in the early 80s. And I remember discussing with him, and he said, at that time, because he was a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, he was looked down upon by his colleagues, because as soon as you practice it, you become fanatic and subjective. So that's the view we have about the mind in the West. We don't trust the mind. But the view in Buddhism is so profoundly different. We've really got to understand it, you know. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about. Okay, so the word Buddha then, let's look at that, because it tells us exactly what all the practice is. The word Buddha, where's my light? There's lots of light coming in from my windows today. Okay, so the word, the etymology of this Sanskrit word, and the same for the Tibetan equivalent, Sangye. The first syllable implies the total eradication from one's own mind, one's consciousness. These words are used synonymously. First point. The total eradication from our own mind, our own consciousness, of all ego, all fears, all nonsense, all the unhappiness, all the depression, anxiety, anger, jealousy, low self-esteem, all that stuff that we are intimately familiar with, all the pain and suffering we experience mentally. Buddha has found from his own direct experience that this stuff in the mind can be removed. So if we spent the next month just talking about the logic of this, we wouldn't have enough time. But that's one of the crucial points we need to understand, you know, how logically this is possible. This is not just belief. This is the crucial point to understand about the Buddha. He's not a creator. He doesn't posit a creator. We don't need creating. He's got a very different view. He was a regular guy who worked on his own mind. He came out of this incredible Indian system before him that we know little about in our culture. We're so arrogant. We go back to the Greeks, you know? But we don't go back, we know nothing about the Indians. It's only now that so much is being published in the West, in the modern languages, in English. coming because of the Dalai Lama, unbelievable scholarship and coming, and we're now seeing this amazing system of incredible philosophy, psychology, metaphysics, great practitioners, great spiritual practitioners, more than 3,000 years ago, easily. As the Dalai Lama said, that was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self, the nature of the universe. Now, we thought it was probably Freud 100 years ago. We're so arrogant. It's extraordinary. And so Buddha came out of an incredible system, went as far as he could go, and then he diverged in his own direction, specifically in relation to his own direct experiential findings about the nature of self, the nature of mind, the nature of the universe, ultimately and conventionally. So, the word Bud, as I said, or Sang, implies the eradication from our consciousness, our mind, of all the stuff that we know is unbearable, but which in our culture, in our neuroscience and in our psychology, we treat as completely normal, crucial parts of the mind. In fact, so normal that, to even consider the possibility that you have no anger, no attachment, no jealousy, no fears, not to mention other actual amazing qualities, you sound like a mentally ill person. So we so totally factor in these parts of a person as normal parts of a normal person in all of our neuroscience, in all our psychology. So this is why Buddha's view is radically different. But the trouble is we hear it as religion, Don't hear it as religion. Don't hear it like a belief. This is what I'm saying. Buddha's a person who has discovered this directly from his own experience. I remember always, I quote this, years ago in New Zealand, in one centre there, one man asked the question, he was a scientist in fact, and he said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? And of course he and everybody else laughed when I said, would you ask Einstein who revealed the teachings to him? Of course we wouldn't, because we know Einstein's this clever fellow who used his own intelligence, who observed the world, the natural world, and came up with what he found. He then, tested those laws, he codified those laws, and then he presented his findings. We know he did not make them up. He did not have a vision. They weren't for revelation. They didn't come from on high. He didn't speculate. He said, this is what I have found to be true. Don't believe me. Check it yourself. Well, that's the Buddha. And I'm not joking, but we don't kind of quite think this. That's exactly the Buddha's approach. So, of course, the natural world that Buddha is observing, and this is where the mind comes in, is much more subtle because Buddha asserts much subtler levels of mind that we do not assert in neuroscience and psychology. This is a crucial point to understand, and we're going to unpack all these ideas. We're going to show all this, right? So the first syllable of Buddha implies the eradication, basically, as they would say it, of suffering and its causes. Then, not only that, if you're on the Mahayana path, there's different paths in Buddhism, different goals to accomplish. And we're describing here the path known as the Mahayana. We'll discuss this. The goal is not only, and there's a nice analogy there, a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. Well, if you like, the first Bud, if you like, speaking loosely, implies the development of the wisdom wing. You've removed all the rubbish, all the causes of suffering, all the nonsense from the mind. You've now accomplished extraordinary clarity and wisdom and joy and blah, blah, blah. That's the wisdom wing. But, we can do more. We can not only do that, the second syllable, da, or sangye, gye in Tibetan, implies the development to perfection of everything else in your mind. Love, intelligence, kindness, joy, compassion, generosity. We know these words. We are intimately familiar. When we speak in modern psychological terms or psychiatric terms, there are hundreds of names and concepts that we keep coming up with that we've never heard of. But Buddha hasn't changed his tune in 2,500 years. And these are words that are really simple. But we really need to know what he means by them. This is the point. We all know the word love. We all know the word attachment, jealousy, depression. These are so cute. They're almost too simple. They almost doesn't sound like serious psychology. You know, we have all these fancy terms and complicated concepts and Latin words and Greek words and hundreds of different terms for different types of mental states. I'm not being rude here. I'm really not. Buddha hasn't changed his way of speaking about it in 2,500 years. So he's either stubborn or it works. We've got to look at that, you know. So this is very fascinating. I find this very fascinating, you know. And of course, the other problem is when we Western people who are educated, including being psychiatrists or psychologists or neuroscientists, we think that's the serious stuff. But over here is Buddhism. And it's kind of vague. It's a bit religious. It's a bit spiritual. You can't take it too seriously. But when you start to study Buddhism seriously, like they do in the monastic university system, I mean, the same level of clarity and precision and analysis is exactly what is demanded. And that's something that is only now being seen in the West when we listen to the Dalai Lama. I mean, the amazing conferences over the last 30, 40 years he's been having. There's an organization in America called Mind and Life. You see their website, mindandlife.org. They've been organizing for 30, 40 years now these amazing meetings of minds with the Dalai Lama and all the other Tibetan scholars, the Tibetan Buddhist scholars, including Western people, and the best brains in our culture. And I mean, you talk to these people over the years, they're deeply, profoundly moved by this extraordinary knowledge that they're learning about now that they didn't know existed before. And they have incredible respect for the Dalai Lama. And it's opening up a whole new world, you know. It's just really amazing. And that's the great skill of the Dalai Lama, to bring people together, you know. It's marvelous. People are seeing this extraordinary system that's been around for 3,000 years, before the Buddha even. It's really kind of it's marvelous. It's kind of a bit humbling for us arrogant modern thinkers who think we invented the universe, you know. So Buddha implies the eradication from your being, from your mind, of all nonsense. Therefore all suffering, therefore all causes of suffering. And Da implies the development to perfection, please hear those words, to perfection of everything else in the mind. That is, simply speaking, implying what a Buddha is. And that is the potential Buddha has found of every living being, every mind possessor. It's a wonderful term. The term in Tibetan that we translate in English as sentient being is the word sem chen, mind possessor. Well, that's the meaning of a being, and that's not just humans. So this is what's fascinating when we get into the psychological component, when we get into looking into the contents of the mind. This model of the mind doesn't just refer to us humans. This refers to every living being. And of course, Buddhism, as we know, and we'll go into this a little bit, Buddha posits far greater, more vast possibility of types of minds. Not just humans. We're a tiny percentage. The Buddha would assert many other kinds of beings. Initially, of course, all this just sounds like superstition to us. But, you know, when we understand that what mind is in Buddhism, and then when we understand karma, and we absolutely, in the discussion of mind, when you study mind just on its own, you don't need to think about karma, but I want to bring in that because the law of karma is the law that plays out in our mind. Or, if you like, all beings live within the law, driven by the law of karma. It's totally to do with the mind. It's totally to do with the mind. In the monasteries, when you study the text called Lorig, you don't study karma at that point, but it's for me, it's utterly integrated, and it's so important for us, you know, who don't have any of these views. If we're brought up as Christians, or we're brought up as, you know, Muslims, or we're brought up as materialists, it's a very different model. So it's really helpful to bring in karma at the same time, because mind creates karma. Mind, as far as Buddha is concerned, is the main cause of all our happiness and all our suffering. In fact, mind is the cause of the entire universe. I mean, this is it sounds absurd initially, which is why we have to understand what Buddha means by the mind, you know. So in terms of this packaging of all the Buddha's teachings, this Lam Rim, mind is studied. There's different stages of practice, and as Lama Zopa, as they say it in the 14th century in Tsongkhapa's language, and as Lama Zopa, respecting the lineage, would say, the first part of this body of knowledge, this Lam Rim, this gradual path, is known as the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability. Then the next level is called, obviously, the practice and teaching suitable to the disciple of the middle capability. Now, that's the wisdom wing. Now, in Buddhist terminology, that's the Hinayana path. If you study in Burma or Thailand, that's what you study. And then you graduate at high school. You achieve your own nirvana and you're out of here and you don't come back. That's the first stages of Buddhism. But then you've got the Mahayana component. That's the wisdom wing. Now you've got the compassion wing, which is the Bodhisattva component. And that's the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the greatest capability, or if you like, the compassion wing. And then you've got you've got Tantra, which is the final stages of the Mahayana path. Well, you know, in colloquial terms, I like to call the first level junior school. We learn, I mean, that's what terms you use in Romania exactly, but you understand my point. And as soon as we hear, so if you hear Lama Zopa's term, the lowest scope, middle capability, high capability, it's very quaint, but it's correct. But as soon as you say junior school, high school, university, we get it. Psychologically, we understand the meaning. And this is a major point. We know in any body of knowledge that we study, you do it incrementally. You do the early stuff, the middle stuff, the most advanced, and then you graduate. We understand that implicitly. And all the bodies of knowledge, whether it's music or math or cooking, are always presented like that. Well, that's the meaning of this Tibetan word lam rim. Path, gradual. It's very quaint, but it's literally Kuru. So, you know, on your gradual path to becoming a doctor, you go through the gradual path of accomplishing to become a musician. Well, here you do a gradual path, and what do you become? A Buddha. That's what you're graduating as. So I use a lot, and you'll hear me say it a lot, junior school, high school. It means the lower scope, the middle scope, the great scope, university, and then you've got postgraduate. That's Tantra. That's the Vajrayana. It fits perfectly, you know. And when we really become familiar with this packaging, then, you know, you could open any book. Like if you are studying music and you open a big fat book with many grades of music in it, and you know you're in grade 4, the moment you open up a book and you'll see one piece of music, you'll immediately know, oh, that's grade 2, I've been there already. Or that's grade 7, I haven't got to that level yet. You will recognize the level. Every body of knowledge is like that, but we don't think of spiritual knowledge like that. But absolutely, and that's the great skill of this Lam Rim, that Atisha in the 11th century, whose text Tsongkhapa used in the 14th century as his basis for his Lam Rim literature, they look at the teachings from the experiential point of view of the least difficult, the more difficult, the most difficult. And when we understand that and know where they all fit, it'll make much more sense to us, you know. Otherwise, we just get confused. Now, the mind is studied in high school. That's where you study the mind. And I'll show the logic of that later. We'll go into it. Of course, you continue to study the mind all the way to Buddhahood. That's when you begin to get into the nuts and bolts of the Buddhist model of the mind, how it works, what it is. You study the epistemological model of the mind, which itself is beyond fascinating. We'll discuss a little bit of that. The way mind functions. This is so super interesting. It would absolutely fascinate modern scientists. The way mind functions, how cognition functions. It's super fascinating. But of course they have to posit the possibility that they're not describing the brain, and that's the stumbling block, of course, for modern people. And then there's the psychological model, the contents of the mind, and we're certainly going to go into that. Not all the components, but certainly the fundamentally important ones. And then we'll also talk about, in our few weeks, we'll discuss Lama Yeshe's beautiful new book, came out last year, called Mahamudra, which is this marvelous teaching on how to use the 2 modes of meditation in order to realize emptiness. And we'll also talk about meditation, because meditation is especially concentration meditation. Shamatha is this brilliant psychological skill invented by these Indians more than 3,000 years ago, which is what enables us to get to this subtle level of mind that Buddha is asserting as existing, that we don't posit as existing in our culture. In order to get to that level of mind, to do this really powerful job of unpacking and unraveling and deconstructing the contents of our mind, so that we can become a Buddha. So we're going to discuss all that. Okay. So let's look at, just briefly, let's look at the kind of the bullet points. What is the mind and what is it not? First of all, the word mind in general in Buddhist psychology and philosophy is used synonymously with the word consciousness, okay? Broadly speaking, they're used in different contexts, but they basically refer to the same. And so what is that? Well, it's the actual experience, it's the actual cognitive process itself. So, and the word is used in a much more subjective way. When we say mind in Buddhism, in the West, in the modern world, immediately we equate it with this up here, the contents of our head, the brain, isn't it? We use those words synonymously. Absolutely not. So the first point for the Buddha, crucial to take on board as our working hypothesis here, is he's not discussing a thing called the brain. That is not equivalent to the mind for him. Which initially sounds like superstition, doesn't it? I mean, what a poor idiot Buddha is. He doesn't realize he's got a brain, you know? No, it's not that. And so I would say, even now before we go further, the simplest way to describe the function of the brain in relation to mind or consciousness is that it's the physical indicator. Certainly only at the grosser level. We'll go into this. That the brain is the physical indicator of what is going on in the mind. So mind for Buddha, fundamentally, starting point, is not physical. So this is already curious, because when we think of, we think of religion, we think of Christianity, Islam, etc., and they posit something not physical, and that's called a soul or a spirit. Then we hear Buddha doesn't talk about a soul or a spirit, so he sounds a bit like a communist, he must be an atheist. But he posits something not physical, but he calls it mind. He doesn't have a separate piece called a soul. So what does he mean by the word mind? What parts of us is he referring to by the word mind? Well, intellectual concepts. If you're a brilliant musician, you have many very fascinating concepts. That's your mind. Theories about anything, that's mind. That's the conceptual level. Emotions, point down here, that's mind. Unconscious, subconscious, instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of our inner being, that is mind, okay? Or consciousness. So it's got so that includes all the negative craziness, the psychopaths, the pedophiles, all their crazy stuff in their mind, that's mind. The saints, their holy, virtuous, good thoughts, that's mind. The subtler level, and so it's a whole spectrum, it's the entire spectrum of our inner being. This is our mind or our consciousness. Mind includes sensory consciousness. For example, eye consciousness, being precise, is that part of your mind that functions through the medium of the eyeball. Ear consciousness is that part of your mind, not physical, that functions through the medium of the ear, the drum, and the bits and pieces. So mind, by definition in Buddhism, across the board, fundamentally, as a starting point, and all the way through, isn't physical. Crucial point to take on board as a possibility. So clearly you can't prove it immediately, because how can we cognize something that is not physical? It just sounds so abstract and bizarre to us. So we've got to take it as a hypothesis. That's the reasonable approach to Buddhism. We tend to think of it as religion, so we think, I've got to believe it, do I? We think we have to shove it in our throat and undigested, and believe in it. No. That's why I never use the word belief. It's a valid word, but I always say it's my working hypothesis, and that's exactly what any reasonable, intelligent, thinking person would do with any possibility of something. You take it on board as a possibility, and then you look into it and you prove it for yourself. That's the approach of science, and that is Buddha's approach, necessarily. So that's one step at a time, one step at a time. So, first, mind or consciousness, they're used synonymously. Second, mind is by definition not physical. You could argue that if we can prove that mind isn't physical, If we can prove it is physical, if we can prove that Buddha's wrong in asserting that mind is not physical, then the entirety of the whole body of knowledge of Buddha's psychology, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy would collapse into a heap of incoherent nonsense. Because the entirety of the Buddhist worldview is completely based upon this understanding of the mind and what it is. So it's a huge point. It's not just some extra little thing you either can like or not like. It's massive in Buddhism. The third point about mind, this is very shocking for us. If you're a Christian, let's say, or a materialist, have a philosophical materialism as your view of the world, which is the prevailing view on the planet, I would say, certainly in the modern world, you at least agree on one thing, that someone else created you. Think about this. If you're Christian or Muslim, God for sure is the boss. He created you. He put a soul in there. At the time of conception, I've just discovered with the Jews, God doesn't put the soul in there until several months later in the fetus. So that was interesting, I thought. But anyway, God basically creates you. And if you're a materialist, we know perfectly well that your mummy and daddy create you. We know that. Well, Buddha has neither of those, which is a bit shocking. He doesn't, a creator in Buddhism does not exist. Buddha doesn't just say, he talks about his whole Buddhist view of reality, of what the mind is, of karma, everything is his whole presentation of how things do exist, and none of them include a creator. We don't need creating from the Buddhist point of view. It's not as if he got up there and started being argumentative and said, chuck out the creator. His view just doesn't involve a creator because we don't need creating. And we're going to go into this. And this is a fundamental point, again, about the character of mind and what it is and what its cause is and where it comes from. You'll see as we talk. So, mummy and daddy, no problem. They do play a role, definitely. They worked very hard to get that egg and sperm together. And we know that became our body. So Buddha does not argue with that. They definitely give us a body. They give us limbs, and they give us a brain. They give us, genes and DNA, all the contents of the physical world. We cannot argue with that. No problem. But the point that Buddha makes is, given that that's just your physical character and it is not your mind, they don't give you your mind. They don't give you anger. They don't give you love. They don't give you kindness. They don't give you, intelligence. They don't give you the capacity to be good at music or football or killing. These are characteristics of your mind. So this is the point now, that if that's the case, where do I come from? Where does my mind come from? We can establish body, thank you, mummy and daddy, how kind you are. But where does my mind come from? The difference between a dead body and a live body is the presence of consciousness. So if it doesn't come from a creator, and it doesn't come from mummy and daddy, then oh my God, well, where does it come from? Well, it can't come from nothing. Nothing can have no cause. Everything has to have a cause. So what's the cause? So my mind, so this is the Buddhist point about the mind. Think of it as they talk about the mental continuum. This mind of ours, one way we can talk about it, it's like a river of mental moments. So think of it this way, if you had perfect memory, you could track back this moment of your consciousness, the generality of your thoughts and feelings and emotions, to the very second before that. And that comes from the very second before that. And that comes from the very second before that. And if you had perfect memory, you'd keep going back. And this is a good meditation to do. You'd keep going back. All through the night, even though you're not conscious, your mind was certainly there. And then you wake up and go the day before, and the day before, and the day before. And you go back in an unbroken chain of mental moments. Inexorably, definitely, you're going to end up at the first second of conception in your mother's womb. Because this moment of consciousness, this is the logic of cause and effect. This moment of my thoughts and feelings and emotions, this is how they talk about it. The main cause of that is the very millisecond before that. It's a very kind of, like in the same way they want to track back the evolution of this tissue paper. At the moment, it's called tissue paper. We know it's made of various components. So if you went backwards, you went backwards in time, this paper, before that was this, it was that before this, before that it was this, and we came back, and you'd keep tracking back, and where would you end up? The first moment of the universe. You keep going back, and because this existence of this material energy comes from the very previous second of the material energy, and from that second before it was this, and that came from this. Everything's like this. And this is the whole point, that there's vast teachings on this, and it's good to meditate on this and to analyze this and think about this. That both, as far as the Buddhist view is concerned, matter and minds are the components of the universe. And in the Vajrayana teachings, and we will discuss this because this is a very helpful way of talking about the mind, in the Vajrayana, they talk about how the entire universe is consisting of the 4 elements. This body and the external world is the 4 elements. So there are minds and there's matter, and matter is the 4 elements. So His Holiness, in all these discussions with the scientists, and I'm just paraphrasing here, as he said, Big Bang, it all goes back to the Big Bang. We want to go back to where did it all begin. We're obsessed with finding the beginning, and this is good. We want the cause, don't we? Where did it begin? So he said, Big Bang, no problem, just not the first Big Bang, that's all. Because the Buddhist view is, okay, the Christian view, we know this. The Muslim view, we track everything back, and we come up with what they call a first cause. Now, I know one of my Christian friends said there are detailed, philosophical discussions how there can be such a thing as a first cause. Well, Buddhism fundamentally disagrees with that. This is where he diverged from the Hindus. Even though the Hindus have the view of karma and reincarnation and continuity of consciousness and all these things, they still have this view of something inherent, intrinsic, permanent as the first cause, the source of everything called God, or even the source internally, this permanent self or Atman or me or soul. That's where Buddha differs philosophically and therefore experientially. You can't have such a thing as a cause, as something that didn't itself have a cause. So the logical conclusion from this, both minds and matter are necessarily beginningless. I mean, this is hilarious for our minds. We have this deep instinctive belief there has to be a first cause. Well, where did it begin? Where did I begin? Where did the universe begin? Where did happiness begin? Even when we go to our therapist, this is the instinctive view we have. We track back, looking into the past, looking for a needle in the haystack, looking for the first cause. Aha, that's when Robina started getting angry, when her daddy punched her in the face. That's when she started getting jealous. We all want a first cause. Now, philosophically, and this is not just meant to be intellectual, Buddha says that's completely irrational. That belief in some intrinsic, permanent first cause is based upon the deepest delusion in our mind, which we're going to talk about, that grasps at this concrete sense of an intrinsic something. It's just not valid, he says. So as mad as it sounds to us, it sounds so absurd to think that my own continuity of mental moments, that at this moment in time is the mind of the person called Robina, that we can't track it back to something. Aha, there's the first cause, God or mummy or the first Big Bang. No, it goes back to beginningless time. This is insane to think about. But at least it's interesting to force ourselves to contemplate the logic of the concept of cause and effect. You can't, by definition, if we posit cause and effect, by definition, you can't posit a thing that didn't have a previous cause. Conclusion, you have to keep going back. And going back and forward is just a human conceptuality. But we have to use these logical concepts, conventionally speaking. So this is the fundamental point in Buddhism. When Lama Zopa started teaching these Western students in the late 60s, early 70s, when he presented the Lam Rim, this presentation of this path, because initially it came in the 14th century, coming from India, where the view just existed of karma and consciousness and reincarnation, in the same way that in our modern world, materialism is just the way things are. So when he's got a bunch of people sitting there, a bunch of hippies who believe in their brain and there's nothing else, they can't just when you hear about the mind having potential and you want to become a Buddha, you know perfectly well that when you die, your brain turns into dust. How can you have reincarnation? So Lama Yeshe's first teaching was a description of how mind is not physical. Mind is beginningless. This is why we're discussing it here. We have to take on this philosophical view to hypothesize this in order to fit all the other views in Buddhism into it. Because if you keep positing the view of the brain, this is not a contradiction. It's just an added point. If you keep only thinking about the brain, then, as I said before, the whole of Buddhism collapses. It's absurd. I mean, the Buddhist view would say your mind is naturally pure. You go to a neuroscientist and you say, will you please explain how my brain is naturally pure? They'll think you're an idiot. There's no view like that. This is not criticizing. It's just that we've got to sort of, we can bring things together. That's what the Dalai Lama does. He's incredible in bringing things together. But in order to bring things together, you have to know this thing and that thing. And here, the thing we're talking here is the Buddhist thing. So we've got to know that view first. Then we know the other one, and then we can see that. Then we can find the common ground. So my job is not to put the two together. I know nothing about Western science, but I can talk about Buddhism a little bit in down-to-earth words. How are we going for time? Okay. I've talked for 1 whole hour. So now I think before we go further, I'd like to have a bit of a break at the half hour, another half hour, have a little bit of a break then. I need to have a quick break and then we can continue. But I'd like now so far, based on what I've talked about, not more, only what I've talked about so far, giving the overview, I'd like you to ask me some questions so we can all get some clarity about our terminology. Are there any questions in the chat box or anybody at all? Put your hand up and talk to me. Nothing? No questions? You agree with everything I say? Huh? You people?
Well, the question is, if there's no God, what's the point of illumination?
What's the point of what?
Illumination? Where does it bring you?
What's the word again? Sorry, darling. What was that word, Cosmin?
Illumination?
I don't understand the words. Please forgive me. It's my mistake.
Enlightenment.
Oh, illumination. No, thank you.
Illumination.
Okay, this is an entire huge topic, but I can summarize it, Cosmin. Okay, so this is where we have to talk about now the word Buddha and the Buddhist view of what a Buddha is and how it's So So first of all, Cosmin. First of all, it seems to me, but I look a little bit that I've looked, I look at the world, listen to people talking, and look at all these cultures all over the world. And it seems to me marvelous human beings over the centuries have been thinking about the meaning of life. I think it's incredible, So you've got all the Christian thinkers, and there's 59 varieties of them, Then you've got all the Muslim thinkers. You have look at the Australian Aboriginal thinkers. Who knows about their philosophy? They've been going for 40,000 years. Their views of the universe are so complex, it's so unusual. They call it dream time. I can't even begin to understand it. So we can see, Cosmin, there are so many views in the world. We know there are the materialist thinkers. There have been materialist philosophical thinkers well before the Buddha too, and before Jesus, well before them. In India, there was a huge philosophy, people who have the materialist view. So we can see all over the world, as far back as we can go, there are people thinking about the meaning of life. That's clear, isn't it? And, materialists, Christians, Muslims, men. And so we know these days what we tend to think of, the predominant view of religion in our world these days, or in other words, of religious philosophy, are views that posit a creator. Would you agree with that, Cosmin? That's what you're calling God, isn't it? That's what you mean by God, a creator, the first cause, right? That's true, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I would say that's true.
That we can see that. But I would suggest the Australian Aboriginals don't have that. I would suggest that some little group of people way over in some country in Iceland or somewhere we've not heard of have different views. The American Indians have a different view. The Indians have Indians in India continent. So then the Buddhists also have another view. But one thing I'm getting to is, it seems to me, certainly when it comes to the religions that posit a creator, and the Buddhist view that posits the word Buddha, there's a lot of similarity, but the radical difference is in the interpretation of those things. So the point I'm getting at here is this. So I remember a couple of years ago, I gave a talk at a Catholic university in Melbourne, in my city in Australia. And I had 20-minute slot just to talk about something. And I remember I didn't know what to talk about. Even in the morning I got to the place to give the talk, I still didn't know what to talk about. So I looked up the dictionary. What is the definition of God? So there were 3 essential qualities: infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, and infinite power. Would you agree with that, Cosmin? Do you know about that?
Well, there's a lot of infinite here.
That's right. Well, they're the qualities of God. That's what my point is. So they're the qualities. They're the qualities that Islam would assert God has, the Christians would assert God has. 3 essential qualities, and that energy of God, these are my words for it, that energy of God pervades the universe. In other words, knows everything, loves everybody, and has infinite power. So they're the qualities of God. And so now I thought, well, that's fascinating, because that's exactly the Buddhist view of the qualities of a Buddha. But this is now the difference. And my topic was the similarities between the definition of God and Buddha, but the differences, Cosmin, are now what I'm getting to. Now I'm getting to the difference. So that even the word superior being, which is the word in Christianity, is used to refer to the energy called God. Buddhism also uses that term. So the radical difference is this. Now, what the Buddha has found is every being, every person, every mind possessor, you, Hitler, snakes, dogs, being a mind possessor, having this mind that is beginningless, not physical, that has this incredible ability to become fully enlightened, to become, as you said, illuminated, which means infinitely wise, infinitely compassionate, infinitely powerful. But the difference is, the Christians say that energy is only one, and that he is called the creator of everything else. He is the cause of everything else. But Buddha asserts that Cosmin's mind is not created by anybody. It's beginningless, and that it has this potential. And the person who the person who does the job of becoming a superior being, of becoming a Buddha, is Cosmin himself. So your mind has that potential, but you don't need creating, because your mind has always existed. So then the question is, why would I want to become enlightened? Because you have, as you progress on this path of developing the wisdom wing and the compassion wing, the very first stages of the practice, you learn to recognize your own suffering, and you realize that your suffering is caused by your own ridiculous craziness, and we're going to go into that. And as you progress, you let go of your own suffering, and you become this marvelous person. And then you look at the rest of the world and you go, oh my God, look at the suffering. And now you go into the compassion wing, and now you develop this incredible level of compassion. And then as you get more and more powerful spiritually, you eventually develop the capacity to manifest your mind in millions of forms throughout the universe, never endingly, to be of benefit to sentient beings. So that's the reason to become a Buddha. Driven by your compassion, you then want to benefit others, and you'll do this life after life after life. That's the Buddhist view, and that's the radical difference. I mean, are you hearing me at all? Any of those points in there?
Yes. And So who wants to become a Buddha? It's called Bodhisattva?
That's right, exactly. Bodhisattva is on the compassion wing, and that's after more advanced levels, where the term there is literally awakening person. You're on the way to becoming a fully developed person, a Buddha, who can then effortlessly manifest throughout the universe as long as time exists to be of benefit to suffering sentient beings. That's the reason to become a Buddha. So the driving force is the compassion. Now, this is a very interesting point as well, you know. I remember talking years ago in Kathmandu at our center there. There was a group of Lutherans, very nice people, these Christians from Germany. And they wanted to know the differences between Buddhism and Christianity. So, I mean, I'm a Catholic, so I told them a few points. But one of the points I described was this point about what a Buddha is, who once you've got this incredible compassion, you only want to keep being reborn, because you can't bear the thought of all these suffering people. They're like your precious children. How can you leave them behind? And you want to be born again and again and again to be of benefit. I remember this fellow, this one of the gentlemen, he was so funny, he was so direct. He said, no, I don't want that. That's terrible. He said, when I die, I want to go to heaven with God. So I'm not criticizing, but you can't say they're the same thing, you know. So there's many similarities, and I think it's so helpful, because to see the differences. So Buddha asserts superior being. At a certain stage in your development, you will be called a superior being, and you keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. So in that sense, Buddha's not being atheistic when he says there's no creator. He's just basically saying he's got a different view and we don't need creating. And when we understand this law of karma, which I want to go into, we realize we literally create ourselves. You see, in Buddhism, there's no concept of a creator. Therefore, there's no concept of punishment and reward, because there's no punisher and no rewarder. We do it to ourselves. We are the boss. This is one of the main points. And that's when I first heard the teachings from Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe. That blew my mind. I loved that point. That was very powerful for me. That, you know, that even beginning to abide by the laws of karma, which we will talk about, it makes you become very accountable, very grown up. You stop being a victim. You stop blaming other people. You start becoming really powerful and self-respectful, and realize, as the Dalai Lama says, the law of karma is like self-creation. So this is the radical differences within Buddhism. Are we communicating, Cosmin?
Yes, and I'm wondering something else. If we create ourselves,
yeah,
then what the Book of Death says? Because if we create ourselves, when we die, if there's no God, we don't exist anymore, is it?
So stop. What's your point there? You made a weird point. When we die, there's no God, therefore we don't exist. What are you talking about? What do you mean by that?
I'm asking, is this the point of view of Buddhism?
I don't understand the point, though. The question
what happens to us, spiritual, after we die?
Well, if I said before, your mind is beginningless, Cosmin. So if your mind is beginningless, that implies you've had previous lives, which implies you're being born again. So here you are. You're an example. If your mind is beginningless, Cosmin, and here you are in a human body, it implies that you, after your previous death, and we'll go into this process, it's very fascinating, then this process of karma drove you to run like a magnet to your mummy's human womb at conception. So clearly, rebirth is implied by what mind is, and it's beginningless and endless. But what liberation is, and eventually enlightenment, is when you start to get in charge of this process and stop being a victim of it, and you can then stop having the suffering rebirths, and you can be in control and learn to know exactly what you want to be reborn, and eventually you won't need to be reborn at all, but you will choose to be reborn out of compassion. We'll go into all this.
Thank you.
We'll go into all this. Thank you, Cosmin. Very clear. Other questions? This is very helpful. Getting clear our terminology, then we can continue. What else, people?
Hello.
Hello, darling.
How are you? Sorry, I didn't.
Good, Sarah.
Thank you so much again for your teachings here.
Good.
Can you elaborate? Maybe give a couple more examples on how you explained the mind, how the mind functions through the mediums of the eyes, ears.
Oh, yeah.
Is that
we'll
the same with touch and taste?
Absolutely, we're going to go into detail about that.
That's awesome.
That's coming. That's coming.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Good. What else, people? Huh? Nothing else?
Hello.
Yes, talk to me.
I have a question.
Where are you? Florin, yeah?
Florin.
Good.
Yeah,
talk to me, Florin.
Romania, close.
Good.
Nice to meet you.
Yes.
I'm curious, when you say mind, is mind the same thing as consciousness? Or are we referring more to our thought process?
No, that's a good point. Absolutely. Now, I mentioned briefly, broadly speaking, Florin, these words are used synonymously. They're used in different contexts, different frameworks. But broadly speaking, consciousness and mind are referring to this cognitive process, thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, psychosis, bliss, happiness, whatever the qualities of your thoughts and feelings, and even your sensory consciousness. These are all known as your mind. Different levels of it and different ways of functioning. Gross levels, subtle levels. They're all, and these words are broadly speaking synonymous, but used in different frameworks, Okay?
I'm asking because usually we have a negative thought, and there is the saying that don't identify with your mind or with your thoughts. don't identify with them.
No, I understand. That's a whole approach. Exactly. We'll go into that. And I think often too there are different systems of Buddhism that would use these words in a different way. That's part of our problem. Because I know I've studied in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic university system from the Gelug tradition. And then I hear a Zen person talk, they talk in a very different way. So we've got to be, and that's where it can get quite complicated and a bit confusing. But for sure, often people, certainly I'd say in the Zen tradition, would equate the word mind with kind of negative conceptuality. So here, we're not discussing it like that. There is conceptuality and there are other levels of consciousness. And we're going to go into the details when we start. And this is also the point that Sarah's asking. We'll go into the different ways that mind functions when we start to look into the psychological model of the mind and the epistemological model of the mind. Then we'll get our definitions clear. Okay?
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. What else, people?
Hello.
Yes.
My name
Hello
is Alexandra.
there. Alexandra, yes.
I'm very happy to be here.
Good. I'm
Thank
happy
you very
here.
much.
Good.
I just want to ask if I understand, like, about conditioning. Conditioning of own experience and human conditioning.
Yes.
It's like a part of the mind.
That's a really good point. I think as we go into more details, Alexandra, we will definitely discuss that. It plays a major, major role. So the way, but briefly here, just to answer briefly, the way they talk in the Buddhist understanding about cause and effect, you study in great depth. When you study Buddhist philosophy, you go into great depth of the different way that cause and effect, all kinds of causes, secondary causes, main causes, substantial causes, direct causes. Is quite precise in this discussion. So they all the time talk about causes and conditions. So a good analogy would be, we know if you take a flower, it's got many causes, right? So but we all know the main cause is the seed, but the secondary causes, the conditions, you can hold a rose seed in the ground, in the sky for 57 years, you will never get a rose. You need the conditions, the secondary causes, the earth, the time, the moisture, the warmth. So they are causes, but specifically they're secondary causes and they are conditions. The main cause is the seed. So that's a good analogy for the main cause of my suffering or happiness is my own particular state of mind. And then the conditions are the various things that arise. Like, the boyfriend who punches me in the nose, that's the condition, not the main cause. It's a catalyst or a secondary cause for the ripening of my suffering. But the main cause is my own past anger. We're going to go into that. So these words are really crucial to understand. Are we communicating?
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
So from that perspective, and we'll go into this, mummy and daddy and genes and DNA and the brain are merely catalysts, are merely secondary causes, are merely conditions. The main cause of everything for the Buddha is the mind. And we're going to try and unpack that idea. Do you understand?
Thank you.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Now,
you.
these
so
are
much.
really crucial points. Thank you so much.